Okay, ready when you are. Aloha.
Mahalo, Eric, and good morning, everyone. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Greetings and welcome to day 3 of the Oceania Study Group Symposium. Once again, I'm Brian Dietrich, and as chair, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here. And already we can see such a range of time zones. It's really wonderful bringing everyone here together. We have a very short introductory presentation, then we'll begin our first panel for today. A reminder that East West Center is recording the symposium, and that we also invite you to use the chat to say hello, tell us where you're zooming in from, and post any comments and questions throughout the day. For today, we have 2 roundtable sessions followed by the ICTM study group business meeting. The business meeting is for ICTM members, but we absolutely welcome anyone who's interested in the group to please join us. So our opening presentation for today is by Rob Thorne, who's joining us here in Wellington. Rob is a New Zealand Māori composer, performer, improviser, anthropologist, and specialist, and a recognized artist in Tonga Puro Māori instruments. Rob has been fusing these ancient voices with modern sounds and technology. And Rob has been involved in many international performances and several albums. The opening presentation Rob has prepared is called Karanga Putatara ki Whanganui Atara, and was just recently filmed for us here in Whanganui Atara in Wellington. Kia ora, Rob. Kia ora, Rob. Thank you for that wonderful presentation, merging your sounds with Te Moana. It's a really wonderful way to start. Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou. Kia ora. Thank you, Brian.
And I'll remind everyone that we'll be hearing from Rob coming up in just a few minutes on the first panel. And we are 5 minutes past, so we'll go ahead and move to that first panel now. The panel is entitled Community and COVID-19, Perspectives from Oceania. And this panel will be chaired by myself, along with Ogia Cruz-Banks, joining us today. And just to introduce Ogia, Ogia is an associate professor of dance at Denison University. Her research combines African and Pacific lineages and is inspired from her identity as a Pacific Islander of Guam, an African-American with roots in Alabama, Kentucky, and Louisiana. Her choreographies and publications includes topics such as West African dance, Pacific and Māori dance, and critical spiritual and cultural health, as well as Indigenous education and performance. It's really wonderful to have you here with us today, Ogia, and thank you for joining me on the panel. I think you're muted, Ogia. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Hafade, kia ora, talofa, bulavinaka. Greetings, everyone. warm Pacific greetings to you all. I call in from Turtle Island, also known as the United States, on Shawnee territory in Ohio. And I'm very happy to join all of you. As Brian said, my maternal side of my family is from the island of Guahan, which is in the North Pacific. And I also worked on and lived in Te Waipunamu in Aotearoa, New Zealand, when I worked at the University of Otago for a decade. So you can imagine I'm constantly surfing the waves of homesickness. So it is a wonderful pleasure to see you all and to share this time.
Hola, Ojia. It's wonderful to have you back here with us, in a sense, in Aotearoa virtually. So just some opening comments. In a recent Guardian article from 12th March, quite recently, called Sea of Resilience, How the Pacific Fought Against COVID, the authors praised the work in the region at keeping out COVID. And this was linked to this film that's been released, Pacific Lockdown, called Pacific Lockdown, Sea of Resilience. Even though some areas of the Pacific have been praised for the ability to keep out COVID, there's a small list of roughly about 7 countries without any cases, and most of those are in the Pacific. And yet the full impact for the region continues and has been profound. Disease has come to Pacific locations, but so too has the overwhelming effects on communities, resources, economies, livelihoods, and global connections. Music and dance are embedded in these issues in countless ways. For example, in transmission and learning, live performance and well-being, and this very symposium and its organization being one response. How do we understand and evaluate these transformations brought by COVID on musicians and artists, cultures and societies, and local institutions? This panel offers an open discussion about some of these issues and problems for the pandemic in Oceania. What new pathways of research could be taken to address and respond to these issues? And we see this panel as a starting point for conversations to continue. And so we've prepared we have 4 panelists with us today, and we'll proceed forward, and I'll turn it over now to Ojia.
All right, so we have 4 speakers today. Coming in from America, Samoa, Papua New Guinea, Tahiti and French Polynesia, and Aotearoa. Each speaker will have 10 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A, and then hope to have a conversation build from there. So I'll introduce our first speaker. Forgive me if I mispronounce. The first speaker is Kuki Motu Tua Sosopo, who is the chairman of the Fine Arts Department at America Samoa Community College. He is also an alum of the UH Manoa Ethnomusicology program, where he graduated with an MA in music in 2005, and his research focuses on Samoan choral music. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's nice to see you all here and looking healthy and happy. Well, I'm going to be very brief as I can and informal, as we were told. So it was March 23 of last year, March 23, 2020, is when things started to change here in the island. Everything was locked down. But before the COVID pandemic, we had already experienced the measles epidemic on the island in December of 2019. So the government restrictions to COVID was a continuation from the measles epidemic on the island. on December 2019. The American Samoa's response is guided by a color-coded system to meet the threat levels. Code blue means a minimal social disruption with an emphasis on social distancing, mask wearing, sanitizing, and all of that stuff. Travel from affected countries were required on full quarantine. That later became that particular restriction on code blue later became to closing our borders. So as of now, we're still on code blue. We haven't moved to the other codes, which included code yellow if we have a confirmed case on the island, and then the last one it would be code red, severe spread. But at the moment, we don't have a case on island, thank God. And when we were closed, all the public schools and private schools, including the American Samoan Community College, were locked. We're not allowed to go on campus. However, all the teachings were transferred to online teaching. So,
Naomi, you're up, and I just introduced our second panelist. Naomi Faik-Simit is presently a dance ethnologist at the Institute of Papua New Guinea Studies. She undertakes research on Papua New Guinea's indigenous and contemporary dance forms, and she is completing the PhD program in dance studies at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. It's wonderful to have you coming to us from Papua New Guinea today, Naomi. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Boina Malana. Good morning, Loiplolgeta. As Brian introduced me, I'm just back in the country after spending the last 4 years in Auckland, completing my PhD thesis, which I managed to submit last December. And as you can imagine, the COVID crisis, which the world was experiencing, was during the time when I was busy trying to complete my thesis. And now that I am back in Papua New Guinea, it's just gotten worse here, the situation here. So I'm in a situation where I am just not in Port Moresby, where my good boss is, Professor Don Niles. Hello. He is right there in Port Moresby, and I am in Rabaul, East New Britain. I'm reconnecting with all my participants who supported my PhD research. So I apologize for any unusual noises in the background while I'm speaking, because I'm actually in my family home with my husband and children in a room. So I am not in a proper office space to block out these unusual noises that will be that you will be hearing during the talk course of my talk. So apologies in advance. Yes, Brian, do I start off I'm just going to share the how the response to the coronavirus situation in my particular context, research context here, and the local people in general have responded to this pandemic, and how it has affected many of the ceremonial rites which have been put on hold, because right now we are into our 4th week of lockdown. Kids are not going to school. My kids are here, and they're into their last final week of the shutdown period. And then they resume hopefully next week on the 19th. So these are the situations that Papua New Guinea is going through. We have where Dawn is at present in Port Moresby. There is a huge number of COVID positive cases and deaths that have escalated. The numbers have escalated in the last couple of weeks. The last 2 months was even worse, and we're still watching the numbers. So many of us here are just at home in self-isolation. People are going to work, but the government has not really imposed a strict lockdown measure. They're allowing especially workers to continue to work, but to observe the COVID-19 measurements, social distancing, washing hands regularly, and all these rules that we have to live with. It's the new, we call it in Tokpisin in Papua New Guinea, new Palapasin, the new normal. So that's what every one of us are being advised to adhere to and live. But for those of us in the provinces, from my observation, the wearing of masks is still something which is still very foreign. And many indigenous communities, unfortunately, I must say, from the ground, they don't observe social distancing. So it's quite problematic when you're trying to inform people. Like I try my best here with my family into the markets or the outside area of our home. We are faced with these challenges where the wider community, as I will share in my my slides, that they have not really fully grasped the danger of COVID. Yeah, so I'll just take you to my slide if I can, Brian. And then
Yes, please, Naomi, that'd be fine. You can just do a share screen like before.
so yeah, so one of the main events that is currently affected here in East New Britain is the annual National Mass Festival. So at the provincial level, we have a lot of performances taking and it attracts a lot of outside visitors who come in to see the diverse mass dances that Papua New Guinea offers. And East New Britain has been the host for this event for over two decades now. And this has been tremendously affected by COVID. As of last year, it was canceled. And we're looking at the situation this year in 2021 to put it on hold until things improve. So that's one of the festivals. And there are also the non-performance of ceremonial dances at the village level. East New Britain is one of the vibrant provinces in Papua New Guinea that observes mortuary ceremonies. And these ceremonies are occasions where a lot of the arts are being staged and attracts a lot of audience from the village and from the province and outsiders as well who are there. They come in and they participate or they observe and they watch and they learn from these ceremonies. Unfortunately, this picture was taken in 2018, September, during my field work back in Papua New Guinea. I was here and I was fortunate to record and take pictures of this women's patete dance. Unfortunately, since then up until now, there have been no more performances of such dances here in the province. I think for the wider Papua New Guinea, they may be having them at lower scale, but here in the province, I can say that according to my informants, they have not staged a dance or presented a dance as yet, ever since COVID hit us. We had a situation where we lost our first Prime Minister, Sir Michael Somare, in February this year, where some of my participants who were my informants in my doctoral research were part of the PNG cultural delegation to Grand Chief Sir Michael Somare's funeral in Wewak, Isipik province. And these were mainly the men. And ritual performance to perform the mortuary rites. And it was during this time that Papua New Guinea was reporting there was the escalating case of COVID, and they were told to wear their mask at this ceremony in Wewak. And it was very, very challenging because, like I said, it is still a foreign thing to wear a mask when you're performing a traditional rite, a cultural rite, as many of you will know, because these people are perform the rites and do everything according to the cultural protocols required. So this was, he died in February, and we had a 2 weeks mourning. The whole country went down on into a national mourning, and then this was performed in March. This was performed in March on the 17th of 2021 here, I mean, not here in Wewak, in the province of our late Grand Chief Sir Michael Somare. And unfortunately, because of the lockdown that we're experiencing now, they cannot complete the final rituals of this performance. So that's put on hold. They were supposed to come back to East New Britain and perform the Kutu Tabu to finish off this ritual that they did, but they can't. They initially planned this for the 9th of April, but they couldn't. So it's indefinitely postponed until we watch the COVID situation, and then we'll set a time where they can finish this off here. Back in East New Britain, where the Grand Chief was born, and then get the dignitaries, the family of the late Sir Michael Somare, to travel from Wewak back to East New Britain to finish off this mortuary ritual that still is outstanding. So these are some of the challenges that Papua New Guinea is going through in terms of mortuary rites, where we've been, I'm sure the Pacific community, I mean, from our observation in Aotearoa, the Maori community were also experiencing similar situations when it came to the lockdown, and how do they pay in full their respect to their loved ones that they lost when they have this, rituals to perform, and the restrictions with social distancing. So it's just a similar situation with our Pacifica community in the region. And coming back, while I was in the process of contributed their knowledge to my thesis, I was able to witness this performance in Vuna Murmur village in East New Britain, where one of my informants' father passed away. And unfortunately, this happened during the lockdown. This was like 2 weeks ago. And they had to do it. A lot of people had to come without masks, pay their respects, and get the rituals done and completed. So these are some of the situations that I am presenting in this panel to give a realistic situation as to how our people are responding to COVID. So it's just two sides to it. Maybe the health department can criticize the people at the village level for not observing, but some of them So yeah, these are some of the challenges that I'm sharing today. And I think that's all. I can leave it open for discussion if anyone wants to add anything to it. Thank you, True, for this brief, these are just my brief slides to support the situation. We're still not improving yet, and it's a really worrying concern, and we hope we get better into the future. Thank you.
Buddha Naomi, thank you so much for that. I mean, there's a number of really, really interesting aspects to that in terms of performance practice, the masks, festivals, etc. And hopefully we're generating some ideas we can come back to. So I ask everyone to kind of note some questions that we'll come back to at the end. But thank you, Naomi. It's really, really fascinating. And we also really wish you and everyone in Papua New Guinea well. We've all been following, the recent news in recent weeks. So do stay healthy.
Yeah.
And now
thank you, Brian, and thank you, True Algeta, for listening.
Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Ojia to introduce our third presenter.
I am welcoming Dr. Goenda. Did I say that correctly?
Yes, yes, it's good.
Juliano Rea, who is a senior lecturer in Polynesian languages, literature, and civilization at the University of French Polynesia. Her research focuses on Tahitian oral tradition, literature, including songs and dances. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing me. Yorana tatu porua. I te imhana yorana to Hamoa, to Papua, to Aotearoa, to Waihi. It mot atat o te wharu mei reatatu. First of all, I would like to greet all my cousins from the Pacific and Oceania and everyone all around the world and tell you that it is an honor for me to be here with you this afternoon, to be able to discuss and share the impact of COVID-19 on two of our cultural practices that are song and dance. Can I share my PowerPoint?
Yes, go ahead. That's fine.
Okay. Okay. French Polynesia compound of the Society Archipelago, the Austral Islands, Tuamotus, the Gambier, and the Marquesas Islands experienced its first case of COVID-19 on March 11, 2020, on the island of Tahiti. Following this, the country's government, as well as the French authority, decided to set up a lockdown from March 20 to May 15, 2020. All festive events were prohibited. It was a total shutdown of public and private cultural activities. Exiting the confinement, the question that then arose was how to sing and dance our music without bringing people together, how to cultivate without meeting. Culture being inherently social, it was difficult to ban birthday parties, for example, in families where people eat, sing, and dance. It was, in fact, one of the reasons for the rapid spread of the virus during the second half of 2020. It is easy to imagine the area parties that took place during these family celebrations. Regarding public space, Te Whare Tauhiti Nui is the territorial establishment that manages all the cultural events that start in March with the Heiva Taurea middle school's dance competition. In June, the Heiva of Tahitian dance schools. In July, the Heiva Tahiti. In August, the Nu'urua Fest. In October, the Heiva Tarava and Pinainai. And at the end of November, December, the Hura Tapairu. There are also concerts, To'are and Tuiro, offered every 2 months, that is 6 times a year. Song and dances punctuated all year long in Tahiti. In the other archipelagos, the Tuamotu, for example, association organizes the Wharerehanga, which takes place every year in September, and in the Marquesas, the Matava'a, which takes place every 4 years. During the lockdown from March 2020 to May 15, 2020, all singing and dance performances have been canceled. The choice of Te Whare Tauhiti clearly fell on the virtual. He took the opportunity to interview the group leaders of HEIVA, around 40, to create a platform dedicated to cultural productions. He also took the opportunity to update his rating sheets regarding the age of the artists, the existence of the Pa'oa and the Hibino in the show. This allowed a renewal, a time for reflection of the way of noting. Since May 15, 2020, singing and dance shows, as well as activities that bring people together, have suffered various disruptions. Cancellation of Heiwai Tahiti and Huratapeiru 2020, behind closed door performance without an audience, rehearsals with compulsory masks. Facing this restriction, economic issues have conditioned the behavior of individuals in the public space. The singing groups, which do not make a living from this activity, do not seek to maintain competitions and festivals. For example, in October 2020, they clearly chose not to participate in Heiva Tarava because they wanted to sing the way they used to sing, with the audience without the mask, standing close to each other. They were afraid to regroup because the people who make up the song groups have an average age of between 40 and 60 years old. As far as dance is concerned, professionals who live only from their activities in hotels, on ships, or in their dance school have found themselves in difficulty because they are dependent on tourism and enrollment in their schools. They have also formed a collective to offer alternatives to stopping their activity to the country's authorities. They were joined by a school of tradition chants from Tahiti. These schools need Te Whare Tauhiti to organize events in its performance halls in order to have deadlines and be able to keep their students. From July 1st to 17, 2021, Te Whare Tauhiti is organizing the Tahiti Amai Festival. All the major professional dance groups registered despite the lack of competition. Since March 2021, there has been emulation among artists who want to express themselves on the stage in front of an audience, despite all the health measures imposed on them. We can underline the absence of the Hura Havatau amateur groups, which ultimately do not exist outside of Heiwai Tahiti. How can research help the dance and song industry? I think in these sluggish times, research itself needs to help itself. Teacher, researcher working in the field on culture need more than ever to collect the practices and knowledge from their matahiapo, their elders. Only on this condition will they be able to help artists who, like the Arioi during Matari Raro, will come to revitalize themselves with the expert who are the researchers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gwenda. Really, really interesting. I'm already seeing, some threads of connections between Naomi's talk and yours about festivals, performances. I was thinking of, and Eric has written in, but I was thinking of the Merry Monarch Festival in Hawaii, which was scheduled to be performed without an audience, the last I heard, and it's now been moved. But there's a number of really interesting aspects here. Thank you so much, Gwenda.
Thank you, Brian.
So we'll move to our fourth speaker, and then we'll come back to Kuki also at the end. And again, hopefully this is generating some discussion, some issues. I'm finding it really, really interesting, finding some of these resonances across the cases. Our fourth presenter is Rob Thorne, who we've saw, of course, at the opening to this day of the symposium. Rob Thorne is a New Zealand Māori composer, performer, improviser, anthropologist, and specialist, and a recognized artist in Tonga Puro, Māori instruments. Rob has been infusing these voices with modern sounds and technology, and Rob also works as an international artist, international performer through live performances and albums. And Rob, it's once again really delightful to have you here for your opening to this day, but also at this panel. Kia ora, Rob.
Kia ora, Brian. Ngā mihi, tini whetu ki te rangi ko Ngāti Maru ki te whenua, ti hei Māori ora. Ko Tainui Tuaka, ko Te Aroha Te Maunga, ko Waihau Te Awa, ko Ngāti Tumu Te Iwi, ko Rob Thorne Tuku Ingoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everyone, and thank you Brian for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation as well. It's an honor to be here and to share space in whatever that means nowadays in regards to what's happening for everyone across our great oceanic continent that we all share. Things for Aotearoa New Zealand, I think, have been somewhat quite different. In fact, I'd just like to say that it's very easy for me to really not understand what's happening in the rest of the world because of how relatively normal things appear or seem to be here. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Yep. I must say that I'm very fortunate on a number of layers and for a number of reasons. And for that reason, I'm actually very grateful. We've had phenomenal management by a very smart government. And it could have easily been a different government because of the way that the elections were timed, and it could have been completely different. I think it should be noted that one of the I'll just put my timer on. One of the government decrees for COVID-19 in New Zealand for dealing with this as a nation was be kind, which I think actually says a lot for the social nature of the way that we've been asked to and expected to deal with the issues in front of us. So it's quite astonishing during certain periods of lockdown when we're allowed to travel regionally to drive down the motorway and to see the signs lit on the side that usually tell us weather conditions or so on, with these big letters saying, you know, be kind. I think it's strange to have a government that this is basically kind of like the catch cry or the number one is to be kind, is to understand that everyone's going through the same thing, but we're all dealing with things in different ways. And that one of the first things that can happen is you can kind of lose it. And for those people that are maybe at that time losing it, for everyone to be expected to be kind to that. So just to give you a quick rundown of maybe if you're not aware of, you know, kind of like a quick history or an anthropology of what happened. We went into lockdown just over a year ago. So we have 4 levels of what we call 4 alert levels. Level 4 being lockdown, which is that we're restricted to a residential, what they call a bubble. And we're isolating, self-isolating at home and not seeing anyone except those people that we're living with. And of course we're going to the supermarket, but usually there's one person in the house that goes to the supermarket. All the while we have the COVID tracer app on our phones, or we're signing in on at various places so that we're able to trace and be traced. And then there's level 3, which is that we stay at home when mostly possible to avoid all risk, and we only see our family, our close family or close friends. That that events or that in the public, that they're restricted to only 10 people. And in public there's a 2-meter social distancing, and in controlled situations like at work it's a 1 meter. So 10 people, and also events are restricted basically to weddings and funerals. And level 2, there's local travel between regions, and that events can be up to 100 people. And then level 1 is basically kind of normality. With all of these, our borders are closed, and like most of us in the Pacific, I think that our advantage, it should be seen as that it is our border, that we have this ocean border that prevents people from coming in, and that can be controlled very tightly. We have a 14-day mandatory managed isolation or quarantine at the border, and people are required to take tests, and those that refuse are kept for 28 days. So we had a full lockdown from March to April. It was 6 weeks from level 4 into level 4, and then we went into level 3 in May, which then 2 weeks later went into level 1. We've had a couple of scares since. In mid-August, Auckland went into level 3, and the rest of the country went into level 2. There's a lot of skepticism around that, but it seemed to have worked, and that kept going until basically early October, when the whole country was eventually back into level 1. And then we had another scare in February, where Auckland again went into level 3, and and the rest of New Zealand went into level 2. There's been a number of government initiatives around support financially. The government, with lockdown, established worker support, which was financial, and if you were a contractor like myself, you had no need to prove that you were a contractor, but you could take a subsidy, a wage subsidy, which I think was the equivalent of, like, maybe it was for 3 months was $8,000. So not necessarily anything that you might have been earning as a contractor, but enough to pay the rent and feed. The Arts Council here, the Creative New Zealand Arts Council, actually began their rollout of what they had in mind, and the arts has been very much an important part of support. I think the government's seen that art is important for the well-being of people dealing with COVID, and so they've supported artists. But the initial rollout for Creative New Zealand was that they topped up the government contractors' subsidy. So they topped the 3 months up to just under $12,000 because they believed that there should have been a minimum equivalent of minimum wage of $25, not 18. This was interesting as an artist because over my 30 years of working with the Arts Council, I had always asked what the minimum wage was if I was working on applications, and they could never tell me. So I thought it was really interesting that they had a financial plan. It turns out that the Arts Council of New Zealand had a surplus that they had spent 30 years not giving lots of people the money that they were applying for and having strong criteria around their applications, and in the process had saved what appears to have been millions of dollars. So they had a whole lot of money sitting in the coffers. So they began an arts grant rollout that was monthly, with the idea of being able to establish ongoing support and sustainability within the arts sector by providing funding at a monthly level around innovations into the arts sector for how you might survive under a COVID. And a lot of those applications, the first initial rollout of those, the first 3 months, was all about developing projects that could be upheld in a level 4 situation. Up until then, they basically pulled a whole lot of the funding around everything except touring. They pulled money on recording because nowadays everybody can record and work from home and have all of this kind of digital support, and they can do it themselves. And so they put a whole lot of money into touring art of all kinds, not just music. And I realize that I am just speaking mostly to music because I don't work in visual or dance. So they did a huge switch, and they continue to roll out monthly. I think for me, I know that I'm just hitting my 10 minutes. The big thing for me is that with that support, and with also the fact that the rest of the world remains locked down, my career was basically an international performative career. And so for me now, it's like I'm just hitting the skids, because the support that first rolled out, I was able to eke on bread and water until now. But now, without that regular support and still without a return of the international market, I'm just looking now at basically what probably most people were looking at last July. So really, in terms, I think that was my talk, was basically kind of giving you a bit of a rundown of maybe how the government was looking at supporting, and there's my alarm. Kia ora, everyone.
Kia ora, Rob. Thanks so much for that. I mean, a number of really interesting threads that I'm picking up. I mean, certainly the trajectory of musicians working internationally, and how this plays out, from last year into the future is a big one, but also sustainability, which we haven't talked about yet, through, you mentioned the Creative New Zealand government support program, specifically targeted for the arts, music, visual, etc., which is also a very interesting angle. I wonder if we could come back now to our first presenter, if Kuki is still with us. Kuki Tuiasasopo, coming to us from American Samoa. And then we can maybe move on to maybe about a 10-minute discussion if we have any questions or responses, pushing a little bit into that next panel. Kuki, are you still with us? Did we lose Cookie
Yeah,
again?
I'm still here.
Hi, Cookie. Cookie, do you want to give us maybe a 5 or 6
Can you all
minute?
hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine, Cookie. Do you want to maybe talk to us for about maybe 5 minutes or so about a particular issue that stands out for you from American
Yeah.
Sound?
I think Cookie may have just left us again, unfortunately.
Oh, sorry to hear that. We'll proceed on with time, and Cookie can jump in when he can. And of course, this symposium, these online Zoom conferences, as I said, part of that reality of trying to connect with each other in the, I think it was Naomi that mentioned the new normal, which I find also quite fascinating to hear this phrase in Papua New Guinea. This is really, really interesting. I wonder if we could open it up to any responses, any questions or comments for anyone from what we've heard so far. And Eric, you were actually mentioning about the New Zealand Arts Council funding. Is there anything similar coming out of Hawaii, Eric, just from your experience, or any kind of sustainability projects that you've been sort of aware of?
Well, all I can share is that Hawaii has benefited from the U.S. COVID response in funding with a couple of rounds of federal funding support coming to the state of Hawaii and then into communities. So with helping folks who have become unemployed receive paychecks. The Paycheck Protection Program has supported a lot of our arts institutions here in different ways, and including adding to the standard unemployment benefit. So, and then as some folks may know, there's a refreshed round of support coming from the June Biden administration. So that's coming through just now. So there's a new kind of shuttered venue operators support for galleries, performing arts programs, and more established theater houses to apply for the funding that they couldn't achieve in their standard revenue streams. So there continues to be government support as we start to reopen in different ways. As you know, counter to New Zealand's COVID management, the United States has suffered greatly. In Hawaii, we've had one of the best case scenarios compared to the other states. But at the same time, Micronesian community specifically and other Pacific communities have been the most affected here in Hawaii, and mostly due to larger family home situations, multi-generational families living under the same roof and sharing the same space and the same air. There are also issues with language and health education, as was shared by the others. Difficulty in understanding, the reasons behind wearing masks and staying distanced when it's so counter to traditional practice.
Good. Thank you very much. Yeah, the Micronesian case is one I've certainly been following with many friends in Hawaii. We've got a couple of responses popping up. I see a question from Rick. Maybe if any of our panelists want to comment on this. Rick is asking if any important artists have been lost specifically because of COVID in various countries. Of course, this can be anyone, but I'm also thinking of the place of elders as well in this. But does anyone want to touch on that? And if you do want to respond to Rick, perhaps we can use the chat with Rick. Other comments coming in here, I'm just seeing Dawn mentioning, of course, the Pacifica Festival just opened in Auckland very recently. This was something that was postponed. And one of the threads coming out of this is the postponement of festivals or holding festivals without audiences, which is also quite interesting in this case. I don't know if Dawn wants to expand on that, but I'm just looking through the list. Michael Webb also commenting the broader issue of sustainable music performance in an era of challenges, including climate shifts and human impact on weather, etc. There's a slowly growing awareness of such matters through the eco-musicology movement. And I guess what I was also picking up on, particularly from Naomi and Gwenda's presentations, was this how music and dance performance is implicated in COVID in so many ways. The gathering together in performance spaces is very much implicated in the spread of COVID, and seeing how that sort of plays out internationally. I don't know if, Michael, if you want to add on anything to your comments there?
Thanks, Brian. Thanks to the presenters for raising these matters and issues. And it was just that I've been thinking about these things. One of the things over the last few years that comes out of areas that I've been visiting and doing some research in is how do we does our music, how do we get our music heard, and you know, how do we connect with the rest of the world? And I think this was an issue pre-COVID, and it's an even bigger issue now, I think, with people thinking about sort of carbon footprint and travel and streaming and all of the issues surrounding how to circulate music. So I just think that it's trying to be creative about how we perform and how Oceanic musicians can get their contribution, their performance contributions heard, not just obviously in the natural context of everyday events that people have talked about with ceremonies that need to go on, but I was just thinking more in terms of livelihoods and so forth as well. So it's just issues that we need to be creatively thinking about in the Oceanic region for circulation and having contributions heard and seen.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I totally agree. For this panel, we've posted an abstract in the program book. There's kind of an extended abstract with a whole list of kind of questions. I think some of the things you're touching on, Michael, I think we definitely need to be discussing more. And so we see this panel as just kind of a starting conversation about many of these issues. Cookie is back. Oh, sorry, we had someone wanted to jump in.
Brian, I just wanted to follow through on that for just 1 minute and talk about what Gwenda raised, this idea of people formally coming together in response to come up with solutions as a group. And there's something very Tahitian about that approach, because I know people, the first thing is to form a group to handle, you know, problems and issues. And I wonder if there's not a model there that could be helpful in other places.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, I previously made the comment how music is implicated in the spread of COVID, but the other side of this is music. There is, I think, some social models there for how to engage, cultural models to engage with these issues in a positive way, I think, what you raised.
I'll just add quickly that in Hawaii, it's been inspirational to see some of these topics come to the foreground. In particular, there's an initiative, I believe it's called Aloha Aina Economic Futures, which centers sustainable practices and drawing inspiration and knowledge from traditional cultural practice as well. Trying to envision a thriving future in Hawaii that is more removed from the extractive economies and tourism, which has been the number one economic driver here for so long.
Thank you, Eric. I wonder if right now I could turn it over to Ojia just for a second for any comments.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's really interesting to think about the new modes of thinking around the arts and the new modes of thinking around how we engage in community in these COVID times. And I feel like I'm still grieving when I hear Naomi and Goyenda talk about, what's going on in your islands. I can feel the grief of not being able to engage in the cultural practices that are our medicine. They are our spiritual leverages, for navigating these moments. And when we are, put in these situations where we're being told that it's dangerous, I have found it super unsettling, especially with performing arts that are about the communal exchange. They're about the bringing the voices together, engaging in close proximity to one another. And one of the things that I'm curious to hear more about is, some of the responses or the conversations that are happening in the local community, maybe in Papua New Guinea, in Tahiti, about, what's so difficult, for these artists who no longer can participate or experience the canceling of festivals. I want to hear more about, just the stories of the local people. Can you share some of those?
Thank you, Ojia. We're just short on time, but I wonder if one panel member wants to kind of respond to, really wonderful comments, Ojia, and I totally agree with you on that unsettled nature of all this. Does someone want to jump in on Ojia's comments?
Sorry, no, you go.
Can I respond?
Go ahead, Gwenda.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. I just want to say that it's difficult to discuss with elders nowadays because they are very afraid about the COVID, and they don't want to be close to a person they don't know. And we try to collect informations, and I just arrived from Tetiaroa Island, and we went there with two ruahine. It's our eldest wahine, and in Tahiti, when we discuss with them, it's difficult. But when we arrived on the Tetiaroa Island, I think it's because we are alone, just with them, and they accept to share with us the tapa and the knowledge and everything we must to learn about them. Nowadays we see our culture, Tahitian culture and language disappear, and new generations don't know how to speak Tahitian, how to make yahima'a, the traditional gentime, s'il te plaît, the traditional
Oven, the earth oven.
Voila, Aerophone. And just that practices, which are simple. It's very difficult for new generation. They don't know how to choose les pierres. Comment on dit les pierres déjà? Les pierres.
The stones.
Voilà. Well, stones, they don't know how to choose stones for the oven earth. And it shows us that on French Polynesia, we are very sad of the disparate culture. Yes. Est-ce qu'il me comprenne? And it's and it's why I close my presentation with the researchers must going close to our elders now, because the COVID-19 is, comment on dit, les tue. Ils meurent du COVID. It's killing them, yeah. And it's very, very difficult for us, because we want to protect them, and we want to collect the knowledge, and it's difficult to try to do our best for having our elders and having the knowledge.
I think that's a really good point, because we sometimes don't think of what happens with this disease, and when it does kill off elders who are these repositories of knowledge, what does that mean for music and dance in the future?
This is another really, really big issue that I think, we need to have more conversations. Thank you, Gwenda and Jane. I mean, I think I'm very moved, very unsettled. I want to hear more. I think Okewing Ojia, the idea of sharing these stories, I think is really, really important. We're kind of at the close of this panel. I remind Eric, if we can kind of copy the chat, we can have that and maybe post that in our newsletter. I'd encourage everyone to keep the chat going, to get in touch with each other. We kind of see this panel, as I said, as an opening to future discussions on sharing these stories and these issues. I found a number of really, really interesting moving comments coming out of this panel. I'd like to thank Ojia for joining me, as well as Naomi, Gwenda, Kuki, and Rob. Thank you all very much. Kyoda. I wish everyone well, good health, and good spirit, and moving forward. Thank you all very much. This was a very, very interesting, very moving panel. Kyoda. Our second roundtable session is called Asia Pacific Modernities, Cultural Solidarities, Connections, and Boundaries. And this grew out of a discussion that many of us have been having in ICTM about the connections between Oceania and Asia. And of course, there is the Southeast Asian Study Group as part of ICTM. These regions border each other and have many interesting overlaps. And so this is partly where this roundtable came out of. I'd like to introduce the chair of this panel. I'll do that in just 1 second. And that's Michael Sentalia. Michael, of course, is associate professor and head of the Film and Performing Arts Department at Sunway University in Malaysia. He studied at the University of Hawaii at Manoa as an East-West Center Fellow, researching in music and dance traditions of East Malaysia, Southern Philippines, and Eastern Indonesia. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for leading this panel.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Aloha, everyone. It's good to see so many familiar faces from both Asia and the Pacific. Okay, good afternoon to everyone in Hawaii, and good morning, I guess, to those of us in Asia, in Australia, and in Papua New Guinea. Before we begin, I would like to thank all panel members, as well as Brian Dietrich, Rick, and the East West Center, and everyone that was involved in the organization of this symposium. The title of this roundtable is Asia Pacific Modernities, Cultural Solidarities, Connections, and Boundaries. The presentations consider both historical and post-national Austronesian connections that bind cultures beyond nation states from Taiwan to Southeast Asia and Oceania. This roundtable consists of 5 presentations and a response to the papers, followed by a discussion when we will welcome questions addressing specific presentations or the theme of the panel. The first presentation is by Yuanyu Kwan. Kwan is an ethnomusicologist whose scholarly interests include a broad range of topics in Austronesian and Ryukyuan music and cultures. His recent work focuses on indigenous solidarity and musical interconnectedness between Taiwan and Okinawa. He was a lecturer in Asian Studies and the Music Department at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, served as editorial assistant for the Asian Music Journal, and is an alumnus of the East-West Center Associate Program.
Good morning from Taiwan and good afternoon for those who live in Hawaii. The title of my talk is Making Waves in Oceania, Resistance, Traveling, and Musicking. Inspired by the volume Making Waves, Traveling Musics in Hawaii, Asia, and the Pacific, this paper adopts a Pacific-based, ocean-focused ethnomusicology of waves in understanding the musical interactions at the shore where indigenous Taiwanese meets Kanaka Maoli of Hawaii. However, let me begin with the Mo'olelo, a story with 2 journeys. 1. On August 30th, 2019, a group of Banza, also known as the Amis, one of the Austronesian-speaking peoples of Taiwan, posted a video under the hashtag Gem for Mauna Kea on their Facebook pages, stating, quote, "We are Mauna Kea." They performed a medley consisting of Hinale Moana Wong's Ku Ha'aheo and Liko Martin's Hawaii Loa. 2. A month later, Ado Galidim Bajidao, another Banza singer, songwriter, and TV personality, visited Hawaii Island to stand in solidarity with Mauna Kea's protectors. This presentation foregrounds non-governmental encounters between indigenous Taiwan and the Greater Pacific, specifically through musical interactions and civic engagement surrounding Hawaii's current Mauna a Wakea 30-meter telescope, or TMT protests. Invoking the Pacific notion of wayfinding, I see the Taiwanese music makers as wayfinders who are on a musical canoe, engaging with the Hawaiian movement. I further identify 2 types of musical journeys. 1. Making music while physically traveling, and 2. Making music as metaphorical travels between musical cultures. Although the 2 musical journeys may create different impacts, I argue that for indigenous Taiwanese, musicking as traveling instigates dynamic forces of encounters that resonate with their colonial past and present, generating more decolonizing waves that reach both distant and not so distant Pacific shores. For some indigenous Taiwanese, the anti-TMT movement in Hawaii feels like deja vu. In 2017, a group of activists, including a singer-songwriter Banai Gusui, her husband Nabu, a film director Ma Yao, and others, marched on the presidential office building and held a series of protests on Katakalan Boulevard against the government's decision to exclude privately owned land as part of indigenous ancestral domain. Hundreds of indigenous and non-indigenous youths, artists, and scholars joined. They transformed the road into a place of convergence, sharing and exchanging indigenous knowledge with each other. This notion of exchange resonates with the Amis concept of mapapalu, which means to, quote, become each other's partner in exchange for labor. The name Indigenous Transitional Justice Classroom on Katakalan Boulevard was eventually given to this temporarily decolonized space. Similar to Hawaii's Pu'uhonua or Pu'uhuluhulu on the Mauna Kea access road, like the inclusive statement, "We are Mauna Kea," the Taiwanese protesters declared, "Nobody is an outsider." Now let's move on to the first journey. For Ado Kalidim Bajidao, one of the reasons she traveled to Hawaii in 2019 was to conduct preliminary fieldwork for an episode of a TV series named Songs Blowing Over the Islands, and in the hope that she could later include the footage of Fastpack during another trip in 2020. The show introduces indigenous music and musicians of Taiwan and other island nations. Ado contacted me earlier in July of 2019 asking me to be her cultural consultant and translator for the project. After I gave her a general introduction to Hawaiian music and the indigenous movement, she decided to link Banai's story and the Taiwanese protest to the Hawaiian movement of protecting Mauna Kea. After returning to Taiwan, she first attempted to write a song depicting her Hawaiian journey named Long Time No See, which was inspired by the Queen's Aloha Oe. Yet both the production of TV episode and the song were eventually suspended due to a number of reasons, including the postponement of FastPack and onset of COVID-19. She expressed her concern saying that, quote, "Witnessing the Hawaiian movement reminds me of the Katagalan one, which was so vibrant and now getting quieter and quieter," unquote. During the series of performances and concert tour performing her latest album Sasilaan or Breath, which includes songs that are collaborations with Austronesian musicians from Aotearoa, Rapa Nui, Solomon Islands, and more, although still link Hawaii and Taiwan's protest by performing Ku Ha'aheo with the Austronesian musicians with whom she collaborated. Here is her performance. However, this exchange is not without its problems. Some of the critics have accused her of exploiting the Hawaiian connection to advance her own career in making an Austronesian musical roadmap, rather than cultivating a mapapaliu relationship with Hawaii. While there appears to be some justification for this criticism, both Ada and her Austronesian partners were able to draw parallels between the indigenous movements as reflections of their colonial realities. Journey 2. The Taiwanese indigenous musicians who recorded the Hawaiian medley were instructed by Dibus, a Banza reporter, singer, and dancer. Her connection with Hawaii began when she studied abroad and lived in Oahu for 3 years, acquiring a deep connection with Hawaii. When asked the incentive to record the video, she explained, quote, "I want to help and singing is the only thing I can do," unquote. She further added, quote, "I want the international communities to learn about the existence of Taiwanese indigenous people and learn about our struggle, just like how they learned about the protests against TMT," unquote. She invited Banza musicians Anu Kalidin Satipungan, Ili Kaulu, and 3 youths to film the video at Zebu, or the tidal mouth of the Sugulan River. The Zebu is thought to be a place of renewal for the Banza people. Some even believe it was where their ancestors landed. The term Zebu also reminds them of the massacre of a group of indigenous men brutally murdered by the Manchu Qing's officials in the late 19th century. In the video, after singing Ku Ha'aheo, Anu plays guitar accompaniment while the others sing and dance Liko Martin's Hawaii Loa. As the song progresses, their dance movement intensifies, and the danfeu, or tiny bells they wear, start to make tingling sounds. Often worn on the waist or ankles, the danfeu and its sounds are symbols of motherhood, as a Banza mother would sew them into the traditional clothing. Here's the video. Oni pa'akako, alana kilana kini ola, na kini ola, na kini Here, sonically, the Banza bell offers a new sensation to the Hawaiian song, an example of the traveling between 2 musical cultures. Performing the Hawaiian songs in an indigenous space where the ocean meets the stream is not only a metaphor that speaks to Taiwan's colonial past and present, but also envisions an indigenous future while simultaneously rebirthing a series of new sensations, sonic organization, and aesthetics. In this paper, I point out that despite the geographical distance, both indigenous Taiwanese and Kanaka Maoli employed a similar logic of practice, such as decolonizing a space by creating an indigenous classroom and singing as performance that includes movements. I further identify 2 types of musical journeys. One, Ado Kalidin Bajdel's visit to Mauna Kea Access Road that later inspires her performance. and 2. A group of banza performing Hawaiian songs in support of the anti-TMT movement. Both of these journeys signal wayfinding as resistance. The former is a physical journey and the latter is a metaphorical one between musical cultures, though the two types of traveling may overlap and interact more fluidly. Using a song of resistance from another Austronesian people, these two journeys enable indigenous Taiwan to circumvent hegemonic intervention by initiating direct dialogue with another indigenous nation. As indigenous Taiwanese engage with the Hawaiian movement, they learn more about the decolonizing waves of the Pacific and find resonance for their colonial past and present. By riding on the wave of Mauna Kea, indigenous Taiwanese and other First Peoples can generate succeeding counterwaves, recognizing among one another that nobody is an outsider. Thank you.
All right. The next presentation is done by Masaya Shishikura. Masaya is a lecturer at Wuzhou University in China and also a research fellow at Tokyo Institute of Technology in Japan. He recently received 2 Kakeni governmental grants from Japan for 2 distinct research projects. He received his PhD from the Australian National University.
Let me inform you first that I slightly changed the title of my paper to Beyond the Ocean, Beyond Academic Boundaries. The reason is that rather than just describing links of Gosal musical culture beyond the ocean, I decided to make this more discussion-oriented paper. So let me start. French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu states, quote, "The past of social science is always one of the main obstacles to social science." End of quote. In this paper, I problematize 2 kinds of academic boundaries or often unconscious biases that can be obstacles for some frontier and foremost studies. Utilizing a case study of Ogasawara musical culture, I consider negative effects of 1. Area-oriented studies and 2. Established or rather stereotyped academic discourses, especially post-colonialism in the Pacific studies. I recognize the advantage of area studies that encompasses interdisciplinary research and scholarship. However, area-oriented approach can also trap researchers into a fixed concept of area and even into the colonial views, as the interest in controlling others has nourished Oriental and other area studies. I recognize that area studies tend to see areas with fixed borders, nations, and ethnicities, and overlook fluid interactions of people and culture beyond geopolitical boundaries. The second problem of stereotyped academic discourses is relevant to the discourse analysis of Michel Foucault, who problematizes the structured layers of knowledge in social science or in a society in general. The repeated and structured narratives can create stereotyped configurations of knowledge or a way of speaking that has created norm, disciplines, and even regulation in academic studies. Particularly in this paper, I problematize post-colonial discourses that overwhelm the Pacific studies. It would be problematic if these layers of knowledge produce stereotyped way of speaking and regulate new and frontier studies. Here, I would like to introduce my study of Ogasawara musical culture that deals with border and frontier issues in multiple senses. The Ogasawara Islands are located in the Pacific Ocean, currently occupy southern and easternmost territories of Japan. The history of Ogasawara is complicated. In 1830, some Westerners and Hawaiians first settled on these uninhabited islands and later Samoa Micronesians also migrated there. Then, since the 1870s, Imperial Japan had sent a large number of immigrants to occupy these islands as Ogasawara of Japan. During the Pacific War, the islands became a battlefield, and all civilians were forced to evacuate to mainland Japan. After the war, the US Navy took control of the islands and allowed only Westerner descendants to reside in Ogasawara. In 1968, Ogasawara was returned to Japan, and Japanese people began to reside on the island again. Reflecting this complex history of colonization and migration, a variety of musical genres can be observed in Ogasawara today, including hula, taiko drumming, bon dance, rock music, choir singing, brass band, steel orchestra, and songs and dances derived from Micronesia. So, how do I describe Ogasawara and its diversity of musical culture? Many scholars recognize Ogasawara as the periphery of Japan and marginalize it as strange, exotic, and minor existence. Others describe music and dance of Ogasawara as Japanese romanticism towards the Pacific. I recognize that these studies are trapped in an area-oriented vision that imprisons Ogasawara as the periphery of Japan. In her anti-area studies, historian Tessa Mori Suzuki argues that the spatial framework of area studies is at times an obstacle rather than a help to understanding the world we live in. Instead, she proposes the view from the frontier to explore a dynamic and expansive worldview from a periphery or boundary. This concept of the view from the frontier allowed me to realize multiple linkages of Ogasawara that expand to Japan, Hawaii, Micronesia, the United States, and beyond. Apparently, Hauofa's Our Share of Island is also relevant to explain unified and expansive musical world of Ogasawara beyond the ocean. However, the Our Share of Islands can also be an obstacle to my study, especially when it is attached to the post-colonial discourses in the Pacific studies. Ethnomusicologist Brian Dietrich also problematizes that the negative influence of post-colonial discourses has shifted the Our Share of Islands to more like a political debate, rather than describing unified features and cultures of the Pacific. In the binary colonized model, Ogasawara is customarily identified in the colonist Japanese side that exoticizes and romanticizes the Pacific. I find dilemma and obstacles in this binary model of post-colonial studies that creates idiosyncrasy in academic studies and prevents to tell multifarious people, linkages, and stories of Ogasawara. To conclude, I recognize two major academic obstacles in my study of Ogasawara musical culture. One is the area-oriented approach or visions that marginalize Ogasawara as a fringe of Japan as a minor and subordinate subject. Another is the post-colonial discourses that are established as almost the undoubtable norm in the Pacific studies. The binary colonized discourse customarily locates Ogasawara at the colonist side. Both prevent to narrate Ogasawara's own stories that actually manifest multiple bonds to other people, cultures, and areas beyond the ocean. With this study of Ogasawara musical culture, I propose to reconsider academic principles, discourses, and ways of speaking that can be obstacles for new and foremost studies. As Ebei Hauofa states, ocean should not be a place to separate people, areas, and communication. Beyond the ocean, we should seek mutual dialogues that transcend conventional academic boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for the introduction. So that way I don't have to go through the awkward process of self-introducing myself. So we can just go straight into this presentation. Aloha. The title of my presentation is Austronesian Logics of Practice, Shared Praxis and Cultural Links Between Southeast Asian and Pacific Island Music and Dance Traditions. Movements, circuits, and voyages of Austronesian communities have shaped a number of Pacific Island cultures and languages. Considering linguistic and earlier ethnographic studies of both regions, this presentation explores links between Southeast Asia and Oceania, conceived as two historically linked cultural complexes and present-day area studies. The conceptualization of regions such as Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Oceania developed as area studies and increasingly influenced scholarship in both ethnomusicology and ethnochoreology. In the 21st century, there has been a recent impetus to consider contributions from area studies and examine post-colonial cultural links across nation-states as well as regions, such as the works of Bill and Sykes for Indian Ocean Studies and Abels for the Asia-Pacific region, looking at Austronesian communities. In view of these contemporary developments, I examine shared features of performance traditions that are indicative of a logic of practice hereby conceptualized as characteristically Austronesian. There are a number of present-day practices that culturally bind the region, including architecture, boats, tattooing, wetland agriculture, bark cloth, and jade carving traditions, to name a few. However, in addition to shared material culture, there are also shared patterns, rationales, and sensibilities for the way that culture is shaped and practiced. Having lived in Hawaii for over a decade, and after moving to central Sulawesi in Indonesia to carry out fieldwork for my doctoral studies, I became increasingly aware of the Austronesian link, particularly given the location of Hawaii at the northern vertex of the Polynesian Triangle and central Sulawesi in eastern Indonesia. My inquiry was not only regarding shared practices such as megalithic culture, but also the rationale behind highlighting the male organ of the Tadulako or community leader in central Sulawesi. Aside from the resemblance to the Moai in Rapa Nui, it also reminded me of the Hawaiian Mele Mai that celebrates the genitalia of the Ali'i in support of the perpetuation of the people. In central Sulawesi, the Kaili Bunja ritual that asks the spiritual realm to ensure good crops, as well as the Padungku Rice Harvest Festival that celebrates the end of the harvest season, parallels the Hawaiian practice of asking Lono for rain, fertility, and good crops, communicating through chant in both Hawaii and central Sulawesi, as well as in celebration of the Makahiki season with gifts and music. The third evident similarity was a linguistic one. Aside from alima, lima, uve, vai, and wahine, mombine in Hawaiian and Kaili respectively, both languages do not have words that end with a consonant, and all syllables end in a vowel, which becomes particularly apparent when referencing foreign terms, such as Pelekane or Beretania, Britain in Hawaiian, and Borahima or Ibrahim in Kaili. It is also intriguing that terms such as susu in Samoa and Southeast Asia means both milk and, well, you know. As such, in order to analyze shared performing arts features in Oceania and Southeast Asia, I depart from a discussion of an Austronesian logic of practice. In this presentation, I pursue the discussion based on Handelman's conceptualization of a logic of practice and the manner in which sonic and movement structures are experienced through concomitant rationales at the micro level in order to explore relationships between Southeast Asia and Oceania at the macro level. Handelman argues that, quote, rituals intentionally organize and orientate us to our horizons of being in the world. Through the different meta-logics that organize the practice of rituals, we are enabled to change and or to stultify in relation to the possibilities that these horizons offer and withhold. End quote. Performance traditions enhance social orientations and identities, and often call for additional ceremonial events and communal experiences. In the interest of time, I discuss selected shared features that call for further discussions of Austronesian logics of practice. A practical point of departure is the analysis of shared material culture. Beginning with Hawaiian instruments, similar practices are perceived in the use of the ka'eke bamboo stamping tubes, the oe bull roarer, the niau kani joss harp, and the ohe hano ihu nose flute, among other instruments, also found in various Southeast Asian communities. Of particular interest is also the arc-shaped monochord of Micronesia and the popondo of Central Sulawesi, which is also present in mainland Southeast Asia. Lastly, I would add shared examples that highlight the relationship of the body with nature as sound-producing devices in both regions. This brings attention to the centrality of the body for the production of both sound and movement, constituting the principal site of coherence for dance and music in maritime Southeast Asia, as stated by Tremelius, and I would argue for Oceania as well. Positing the body as cultural locus for the examination of the sound movement continuum provides a common ground for shared discourses within both ethnomusicology and ethnochoreology as disciplines, as well as Southeast Asia and Oceania as area studies. A second point of departure lies in instrumental arrangement and functions within ensembles. Both the Tahitian drumming and the Balinese conkebiar traditions include a beat marker by the Pahu and the Kempli, a density referent done by the Fa, Tete, and the Chen Chen, and a composite interlocking pattern between different instruments commonly split with seemingly triple subdivisions, carried out by the Toere and the Gangsa respectively. Additionally, there are parallel sonic aesthetic choices with the addition of the tini or tin drum and the development of gamelan gonkebiar since the early 20th century, characterized by sudden dynamic and tempo changes. In both cases, oral stories attribute influences from the snare drum of European bands, product of a shared colonial history in both regions. Lastly, in both traditions, the drum communicates with the dancer through both musical cues as well as gestures in order to signal a change to a different pattern or section affecting its concomitant movement motifs. A third point of departure lies in the ceremonial practices and the communal experiences of performance traditions. In Hawaii, the use of a kahea as an entrance call, the ka'i entrance for the dance, the pule prayer to ensure a smooth delivery offering, the pale clearing the space or air in order to make sure that it is safe to perform, closing with a mahalo or thanks, and a pana to honor the place are experienced in a number of Southeast Asian traditions, as seen in the column on the right. Additionally, both regions recognize the meaning of the breath or wind. In Hawaii, the greeting through the exchange of ha, or the breath of life, symbolizes a shared space and spiritual connection. In Malaysia, the angin or wind is an important feature of traditions such as Makyong that begin with the gerak angin, literally to move the wind. Additionally, in Hawaii, the breath is believed to possess mana or spiritual power, which parallels the concept of taksu among the Balinese. These features of performance traditions that are indicative of a logic of practice, hereby conceptualized as characteristically Austronesian, may provide alternative ways of conceptualizing regional studies, but also establish new discourses and exchanges for the analysis of performance heritage in what is now Oceania and Southeast Asia. The analysis of Proto-Austronesian as a proto-language could pave the way to look at Proto-Austronesian cultural practices as well as the domestication of external cultural influences.
It may also highlight additional cultural links, just as the name Hawaii resembles the Proto-Polynesian Savaiki, meaning homeland, at times underworld or ancestral world, along with its cognates Havaiki among the Maori, Havaiki in Rarotonga, Savai'i in Samoa, with its possible reference to Javaiki in Southeast Asia. As such, the Austronesian context may serve as a point of departure to consider shared features and idiosyncrasies of performing art traditions in Southeast Asia and Oceania. Mahalo and matur nuwun.
Okay, our next presentation is by Don Niles. Don is acting director and senior ethnomusicologist of the Institute of Papua New Guinea Studies, where he has worked since 1979. He researches on many types of music and dance in Papua New Guinea, including traditional, popular, and Christian forms.
The title of my paper is Jumping Boundaries, Looking to Papua New Guinea's West for Cultural Links. I'd particularly like to thank Maiko Santaella for organizing this roundtable, the other participants, and Rick Tremios for being our discussant, and also Brian Dietrich and our other hosts for enabling us to gather. As someone working on traditional music in Papua New Guinea, borders have long been of interest to me. Of course, there are political borders on international and more local levels, but for Papua New Guinea, there are an abundance of languages, and maps beautifully try to show the borders where such languages are spoken. And then there are other borders that purport to map out some sort of culture areas, such as those of Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia, and Australia within the larger cultural region of Oceania, the subject of our study group. Many years ago, ethnomusicologist Arthur Zimon asked if his research in Irian Jaya, that is the western part of New Guinea Island and politically part of Indonesia, was something that should come under the interests of our study group. I thought that this was a rather silly question at the time. Of course, Irian Jaya should be included. I'm sure the chair of the study group, Barbara Smith, very diplomatically encouraged discussion, but then reassured Arthur that his work certainly was our concern. Only later did I realize that Arthur's question was a perfectly natural one and certainly not silly at all. His research in Irian Jaya was intertwined with his work in Java, Borneo, and Sumatra. Hence, he was approaching Western New Guinea from island Southeast Asia. Aside from political boundaries placing Indonesia in Southeast Asia, cultural mapping seemed to follow suit, putting Indonesia as a whole there as well, not in Oceania, a great example of convenient political boundaries trumping any internal cultural ones. Yet, we must also keep in mind that the cultural boundaries of Oceania we almost always encounter are really often not very cultural at all. My point in this brief presentation is simple. Boundaries can be very useful and are probably to some extent necessary in our attempts to order the world, but they can also be restrictive and limiting. Don't let them be. Yet, these divisions are commonplace. Oceania as an entity with divisions into Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia is everywhere, sometimes including Australia, sometimes not. Barbara Smith used these divisions in the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians in 1980, and it probably would have been surprising if she had not. As other researchers have pointed out, Polynesia as a term was coined in 1756 by a French geographer, Charles de Brosse, and originally included most of the islands of the Pacific. In 1832, 76 years later, French explorer Jules Dumont d'Urville developed and popularized the division of Oceania into Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. With some changes in boundaries along the way, this is the map and the image that still dominates popular and some scholarly thinking today. While these divisions are convenient, they are rather unhelpful in understanding the region culturally, even though we have used them for so long. This is particularly true for the label Melanesia. In short, Melanesia as a cultural area shows few internal commonalities. Researchers such as Serge Cherkesov and Bronwyn Douglas have clearly shown that the term Melanesia, in particular, was constructed entirely on the basis of the perceived skin color of the inhabitants as part of a larger discussion of what was called race, hence Melanesia or Black Islands. Almost all of this discussion placed dark-skinned peoples at a much lower level of development, intelligence, and beauty than others. Cherkesov reminds us, quote, "We have forgotten that on our maps of the Pacific, Melanesia is there only for a racial reason. We must keep it at the back of the mind to avoid falling into the illusion that all the people living in Melanesia have a common historical and linguistic origin. They do in Polynesia and Micronesia, they don't in Melanesia," end quote. But if we want to abandon such traditional groupings or boundaries, are there ones that have greater cultural validity? Of course there are. For example, maps with linguistic boundaries in the Pacific area continue to be fine-tuned and have long been useful in understanding movements of speakers of languages, such as this one showing the wide extent of the Austronesian family of languages, with Taiwan as the origin of all Austronesian languages shown in purple. Additionally, archaeologists and linguists have suggested a fundamental division between near Oceania and remote Oceania. Near Oceania is populated by people who arrived up to 60,000 years ago, resulting in the massive linguistic diversity found today in New Guinea, Australia, and parts of the Solomons. And remote Oceania, where all languages are related, they're all Austronesian, and have a much more common history going back just a few millennia, such as the case in Polynesia, Micronesia, and island Melanesia southeast of Solomons. In this map, near Oceania and remote Oceania are overlaid on top of the traditional divisions of Oceania. Note how the boundaries of Melanesia are unrelated to this distinction. In Papua New Guinea, we are very much aware of our international border with Indonesia, dividing the main island in half. And while cultural links are readily acknowledged, there are also things across the border that are felt to be quite foreign to what is thought to be typically New Guinean. This became particularly apparent to me in 2017 when I attended a conference on Papuan languages held in Manokwari, West Papua, my first and sadly only visit to that part of the island. Some things looked very familiar while others were more strikingly different. Musically, for example, hourglass-shaped drums held in one hand and struck with the other are common throughout much of Papua New Guinea. But then I saw images of huge drums slung over the shoulder and played with sticks in West Papua. Then there were groups playing metal gongs in West Papua, something Papua New Guinea only experiences during dragon and lion dances during Chinese New Year, performed by people of Chinese ethnicity and their supporters. But metal instruments are found in various parts of West Papua. And even the seemingly ubiquitous string band instruments sometimes incorporated huge horizontal guitars and occasional metal horns in West Papua. It seemed I definitely was in New Guinea, but it certainly wasn't Papua New Guinea. Coming from a country where diversity is the norm, these different takes on all too familiar forms were for me simultaneously enlightening, fascinating, and stimulating. and I want to know more about them and how they relate or not to Papua New Guinea. Yes, the border is there, but only to be jumped, not to stymie research. So, let us not be too concerned about standard groupings, whether they be Melanesia, Oceania, Southeast Asia, or whatever, particularly those that may tend to block considering relationships. In what is a rather old idea, perhaps, I think it would be better to look at features that suggest cultural traits distinctive of a region rather than having to work within pre-established regions that have little or nothing to do with culture, except perhaps the culture of the people who proposed them in the first place. Of course, that is precisely what the other participants in this round table are doing, all dealing with areas that might stretch the borders of Oceania according to some definitions, but that offer insights into what these terms may really mean and if they are of any use at all. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. Thank you, Baraheria. Thank you, Tru. Terima kasih.
Okay, and the last presentation of this panel is by Stephen Weil. Steve taught at Monash University, City University of New York, and Australian National University. He was a research fellow and research director at the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. He is a former executive board member, vice president and secretary general of ICTM, and chair of the study group on the music and dance of Oceania. His main research interests are the music and dance of Aboriginal Australia.
Aboriginal Australia in Oceania, Does History Trump Culture? By Stephen Weil. The original theme of this symposium was a maritime metaphor likening cultural change and ocean traveling. While Aboriginal Australia has traditionally been included in Oceania, it is difficult to conceive a topic linking it with this theme. Does Aboriginal Australia truly belong in the broader group? On Captain Cook's first voyage to the Pacific, he sailed along the entire east coast of Australia, calling into Botany Bay, about 10 kilometers south of today's Sydney CBD, and, after colliding with the Great Barrier Reef, to a spot in North Queensland for repairs. The reception he received from the local inhabitants differed between "go away" in the south and cautious curiosity in the north. It was the exploration of Botany Bay that proved the more faithful. On their return to England, Joseph Banks enthusiastically recommended Botany Bay as a suitable location for British colonization. Less than 20 years later, 11 British ships full of convicted criminals, Marines to guard them, and a governor arrived at Botany Bay. It was quickly decided that Sydney Harbour was the better place for a settlement. So began the modern nation of Australia and the eventual dispossession of its Aboriginal inhabitants. The Australian continent is bounded by the Indian Ocean to the west, Southeast Asia and Papua New Guinea to the north, the Southern Ocean to the south, and the Pacific Ocean only to the east. Almost certainly, Australian Aborigines came from Southeast Asia, the island of New Guinea, and a land bridge to Australia. As archaeological evidence shows, Aboriginal people have occupied Australia for at least 60,000 years, far longer than the rest of the South Pacific. And there is no evidence they were seafarers capable of exploring or even less settling the islands of Polynesia or even Melanesia. Yet, from the time of Cook's first voyage, Australia became known as part of the South Pacific. Although this is less the case today, the modern equivalent is the inclusion of Aboriginal Australia in the cultural bloc called Oceania. It is well known that the indigenous languages of island Oceania predominantly belong to the Austronesian family, which predominates also in insular Southeast Asia and in Aboriginal Taiwan, the probable origin of Austronesian. Yet there appears no historical or genetic relationship between Austronesia and Australian Aboriginal languages. There may be a distant relationship between languages spoken in highland Papua New Guinea and Australian languages, which otherwise seem to constitute a language isolate. Unlike the rest of Oceania, it is well known that Australian Aborigines were predominantly hunter-gatherers, although recent historical research indicates that Aborigines in many parts of Australia were at least incipiently agricultural. A hunter-gatherer economy led to semi-nomadic traveling in small bands of related families within defined tribal boundaries rather than settled communities. Religious beliefs focused on the activities of ancestors, spiritualized in millennia of retelling. Ancestral activities are celebrated in stories, songs, dances, visual designs, and ceremonies. In the classic model of Aboriginal culture, bundles of ancestral commemoration frequently follow the routes of ancestral travel, sometimes over hundreds of kilometers, which their latter-day descendants also followed, and which defined the features and boundaries of the community's country. Just as I am conscious of overgeneralization of Aboriginal culture as a whole, I'm even more so of generalizing about Aboriginal music and dance more narrowly. Even excluding the Torres Strait, traditional musical and choreographic styles vary greatly across the continent. But some generalizations can be made which perhaps can be contrasted with the rest of Oceania. We can start with the sound components of traditional Aboriginal musical performance. Singing is paramount, and there are virtually no examples of purely instrumental music. Similarly, almost all singing is accompanied instrumentally. The instrumental accompaniment to singing is almost always idiophonic, at least in part. Paired clapsticks of one sort or another, beaten rhythmically together, constitute the most common idiophonic accompaniment to men's singing, but there are others, such as hitting the ground with a stick or shield. Women's singing is more commonly accompanied by body percussion, such as hand clapping and thigh slapping. Other body percussion, such as buttock slapping, is used in some restricted areas. The next most important instrumental class, represented traditionally in Aboriginal Australian performance, is the aerophone, most famously the end-blown trumpet commonly known as the didgeridoo or yirdaki. Traditionally, this was played in northern Australia, although such a trumpet was also reported in the past to exist in Central Australia and was recently revived in a northern Central Australian community. Note that there were no membranophones or drums except as introduced from the Torres Strait. Also, there were no flutes, nose-blown or otherwise, or chordophones, unlike Oceania. Musical and choreographic styles vary greatly across the continent, from predominantly solo singing in the central north to predominantly group singing in the center, from monotonal chanting in the northeast to singing over an octave range or more in the center, and from group dancing in the central north to solo dancing in the center. Characteristically across the continent, in both singing and dancing, is the high degree of individual performance variability. As one observer of Northeastern culture put it, the solo dancer becomes and so defines the ancestor being commemorated. Similarly, it could be said that the solo singer or Central Northern Australia, who chooses which textual phrases to sing from a range of phrases available for each ancestral subject, defines the ancestor during performance. In cultures where group singing is the norm, performance can be described using the old term heterophony, and where dance is a group activity, individual dancers are generally allowed considerable latitude during performance. The individualism of Australian Aboriginal performance can be appreciated when contrasted with the Pacific Island performance of the Torres Strait. For example, in the documentary film The House Opening, set in Cape York Peninsula, northeastern Australia, highly individualized Aboriginal dancing contrasts with synchronized group performance of island-style dancing derived from the Torres Strait. These evidences of a different prehistory, culture, language affiliation, musical instrumentation, and musical and choreographic styles in relation to other oceanic cultures have nevertheless not prevented considerable historical interaction between the two cultural groups. Torres Strait Islanders, traditionally inhabiting the islands between Cape York and Papua New Guinea, are counted as indigenous Australians, but they do not self-identify as Aboriginal. Culturally, they are Melanesian. Yet, there is considerable intermarriage between the two indigenous populations, and consequently, a large cohort of mixed descendants. Australian Aborigines have also made common cause with the indigenous people of New Zealand, or Aotearoa, although the Treaty of Waitangi is far in advance of anything achieved in Australia to protect the rights of the indigenous people. Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders have regularly participated in the Festival of Pacific Arts, including hosting the festival in 1988 in Townsville, Queensland. The 1988 event was funded by the Australian government as part of the year-long celebration of the bicentenary of the first British settlement of Australia, following Cook's first voyage to the Pacific. 1988 was marked by extensive protests against the dispossession of Aboriginal Australians. Yet it was fitting that the 1988 festival marked the occasion when Australia was first included in the South Pacific. Despite the many differences between the Aboriginal people of Australia and the indigenous peoples of the South Pacific, there are historical connections from the time of Cook's first voyage to the Pacific in 1770 have forged a bond that has only grown over the ensuing 250 years.
Okay, and now we move on to the response to the papers, which will be delivered by Ricardo Tremillos. He probably doesn't need an introduction, but I'll read it nonetheless. Rick is Professor Emeritus in Asian Studies and in Ethnomusicology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. His theoretical emphasis encompass music and ethnic identity, the arts and public policy, and issues of gender in the arts of the Pacific and Asia. He has published on musics of Hawaii and Southeast Asia. Rick, time is yours.
Thank you. I thank my colleagues for their thoughts on our theme. What are the linkages among the musical cultures of Oceania and Asia? Due to time limits, I comment only on selected items from each presentation and then offer a few general thoughts anticipating the open discussion. I intend to be provocative, so I apologize in advance if I offend anybody. First paper, Kwan Ganyu examines time-specific musical journeys between Aboriginal Taiwan and Aboriginal Hawaii. The latter term is etic, but useful as a label. The actual journeys are mutual, while the wayfinding devolves upon the Aboriginal Taiwanese rather than the Aboriginal Hawaiians. Significant is that the actual musical journeys inspired by the TMT protest and its Taiwanese support arise from a speculative, if not imagined, Lapita-Austronesian connection. As a triumphalist note, these Aboriginal connections putatively circumvent hegemonic power structures. However, there is still an asymmetry of power and interaction. The Hawaiians present a strategy of resistance, and the Taiwanese receive it. In contrast, Masaya Shishikura immediately challenges the relevance of our area categories, Asia and Oceania, for Ogasawara musics. He critiques them as constructions of convenience for an academic hegemon. Further, he interrogates notions of area studies, its methodologies, and its discourses. Rather than victims, the Ogasawara Islanders are consciously complicit, exoticizing themselves for various agendas, political and economic as well as cultural. Shishikura's critique suggests that placing Ogasawara against a paradigm of the Pacific or against a paradigm of Asia is like forcing the proverbial square peg into one of two round holes. Michael Santaelia's contention that a different term enables us to think in a different way resonates with Bloom's signal book, The Linguistic Shaping of Thought, a study in the impact of language on thinking in China and West, 1981. For Santaelia, the term Austronesian liberates us from a mindset of empire and nation and invites us to imagine other prehistorical and contemporary linkages between Hawaii in Oceanic Polynesia and Sulawesi in Asian Nusantara. He draws examples from organology, sonic organization, cultural practices, and language, and argues for a shared logic of practice. I note his two cultures share a status of marginality. Hawaii is marginal to Central Polynesia, and Palu Sulawesi to the cultural hegemony of Java. Don Niles reports difference rather than sameness on New Guinea Island. This immediately brings to mind the late 19th century cousins Galton and Darwin and the argument of nurture versus nature. Nurture could be the variable, that is, for example, Indonesia's occupation of Irian Jaya contrasts with Australia's colonization of Papua New Guinea. However, Niles posits diversity for his near Oceania, which supports the nature side of the argument. Niles, like Shishikura and Santaelia, finds present area designations not completely satisfactory for his work. He concludes that the area should not define the research, but rather the research should define the area. An example of which is the exploratory study of Chinese music in the Pacific, organized by Barbara Smith in 1992. Stephen Wild's thoughts, elegantly delivered by Kim Woo, further problematize the notion of area. Aboriginal Australia evidences few historical relationships with its South Pacific neighbors, let alone with a greater Austronesia. It develops a shared history only after Western contact and, put crudely, has been shoehorned into a contemporary South Pacific identity. Wild concludes with a conciliatory observation, quote, despite the many differences of Aboriginal Australia and the peoples of the South Pacific, historical connections to the time of Cook's verse voyage have forged a bond that has only grown over ensuing 200 years. I suggest that these connections beginning with Cook not only forged a bond, they forced a bond. Another case of a square peg and a round hole. What began as a rather parochial exercise, that is, exploring musical commonalities within insular Southeast Asia and Oceania, in fact, has generated a critique of one of our most sacred cash cows, the cultural area as currently constructed and funded. The critique suggests that these constructions are often for the convenience of hegemons, rather than relevant to the people that inhabit their borders. Macro constructions of convenience include the categories of Asia and of Oceania. Micro constructions of convenience also exist. As example, Wilde points out that the instrument we identified with Aboriginal Australia, the didgeridoo, is in fact not pan-Aboriginal, but the label Australian Aboriginal is convenient for record sales and for music survey courses. Further, political boundaries of empire and nation, including protectorates and compacts of free association, can influence musical production and valorization, both negatively and positively. Political borders can separate peoples that are actually musically and culturally related, and conversely, they can force unrelated peoples into coexistence, a forged and forced bond that often generates a minority status. Returning to the original exercise, I recall one of many folksy insights from ethnomusicologist and friend Harjo Susilo. He opined that there are two ways to construct categories, one which he called the trash can strategy, and the other the trash bag strategy. The trash can only accepts items that can be contained within its rigid form. The trash bag accommodates to the shape of whatever is placed in it. For me, the trash bag metaphor speaks best to organize the putative relationships between Oceania and Asia, the actual and the imagined, the historical and the contemporary, the evolved and the imposed. Thanks again to my colleagues for providing such rich material for our discussion.
Okay, well, on that note, I think we have to begin to wrap up this discussion because Brian mentioned that we have to move on to the next meeting. So I think I'll take this moment to thank all the panelists, and maybe we can give them a virtual round of applause to all presenters.